Bank Studios. This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. A good observation from a guy who writes for Daily Wire. In saying that in 1 week, X users did more investigative reporting into Tim Walz than all of Minnesota media did in 20 years. National media is trying to run the same playbook, bury the story, and look the other way, but without the control of X, they're screwed. It's really a good point. It's a good point on a couple fronts. One is the description of X and the importance of crowdsourcing information, because you can't trust the D.C. press corps, obviously. The other piece of it is the death of local news. And local news, to the extent it exists, becoming just simply a sort of subordinate player to the D.C. press corps on the media flowchart, where they do the same thing that they watch their D.C. betters do when it comes to not asking difficult questions or covering for the warts of people who they're otherwise aligned with politically. It's really true. I mean, all this stuff that has been unearthed about Tim Walz, none of it has come from the D.C. press corps. It has all come organically, and it's really a conversation we're having with ourselves while they're doing damage control on behalf of Tim Walz. Now, I hate to spend too much time on Tim Walz because the principal is Mamala, but Walz is an illustration of her judgment. And so you need to get the full dossier on Walz, if you will, and then package them together when it comes to the branding.
Yeah, she was the first decision he made. And I think, well, I'm glad she picked him over Shapiro. But everything he did during COVID, because he was the original lockdown king along with Governor Pritzker and Newsom, his mother, his own mother, he did this to his mom.
And this is what we do in my family. But we can't. My 87-year-old mother had heart surgery. We isolated her. Our goal was to bring her up here and live with us for a while. We can't bring her. So she is alone. We're dropping groceries at the door. We have to, because otherwise what that front page story is going to go on day after day after day.
I mean, he worried more about the front page story than he did his own mother. If you're ever going to show compassion, that was the time to do it to your own mother.
Nice touch. He dropped rosaries at the door. Right. Says the guy who legalized pedophilia in his state. Do you know that about Tim Walz? It's not just that he's a big queen, LGBTQIA, two-spirit plus advocate, that he supports the mutilation of kids on the altar of gender politics. It's also that specific legislation, and I read this over at Peachy Keenan's piece, good Substack, and they've got the receipts. The legislation in Minnesota,
the trans refuge law. That one?
If the citation for those scoring at home was HF 1655, and he opposed language that would have excluded pedophilia from sexual orientation, the sexual orientation definition, supported it when pedophilia was included as just another sexual orientation. That's the sickness that you have here. And, of course, it's the inevitability that we've talked about for a long time. I mean, there's so much more, too. I mean, there's been a lot of legitimate talk about stolen valor. We discussed again this morning a little bit with Stephen Bucci about his opposition to our First Amendment free speech rights, which we've played a few times now because it can't be heard enough. It's that important. But there's also the relationship he has. It's unclear, but he spent a lot of time in communist China over the years. In fact, he's had a 30-year partnership with a Chinese travel agency, and he spent a year there teaching English, and then he's taken students on trips there for 30 years. The last trip was in 2003.
He honeymooned there. I know that.
Right.
Clintons did Haiti and he did China.
Maybe he knows where Tank Man is, or who Tank Man is. I don't know. For more on all this, we're pleased to be joined by Joel Pollack, who's senior editor, Breitbart News, senior editor at large for Breitbart News. He's also the author of the new book, The Agenda, What Trump Should Do in His First 100 Days, which is available on August 20th. But, of course, you can pre-order it at all the usual spots. Joel, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Good morning.
Where do you sort of fix your sights on the Tim Walz record?
Well, Tim Walz is an interesting pick for Kamala Harris. He's not an attempt to reach the undecided voters or the moderate voters or the swing states. He is a left-wing governor, and the controversy over his military record is going to keep him in that corner. The Democrats who know they're voting Democrat don't care about Tim Walz's stolen valor. It's not going to discourage many of them from voting for him or for Kamala Harris. Her strategy is simply to rally the base, and the base wants to be rallied. They were depressed for months seeing Donald Trump vigorous and healthy and surviving all kinds of obstacles while they saw Biden decaying and failing and unable to govern. So there's a kind of euphoria that they actually have some kind of alternative now that they can vote for, and they're not going to dump Tim Walz. If you've talked to Democrats in recent weeks as they've reacted to the Kamala Harris pick and now the addition of Tim Walz to the ticket, they're finding every kind of rationalization to vote for her and to vote for her and him. So what this stolen valor story really means is that it's going to further limit their appeal outside of hardcore Democrats, but it's important in that it means the middle is still up for grabs, and Donald Trump needs to make his pitch to the undecided voters, such as Remain, and to go for moderates and to rally his own supporters who are feeling a little demoralized. You know, there was a kind of euphoria around the Republican convention last month because people were so thrilled that Trump had survived an assassination attempt and they felt the party had come together and people were looking forward to victory. Now there's a sense of dismay and fear, really, because they've seen the giant media propaganda machine move into motion to create a false idea of who Kamala Harris is, to make the 20 years of her political career simply disappear as if it didn't matter, and to introduce her as some kind of new candidate. Now, of course, they're trying to cover up for Tim Walz. And that reinforces a sense among Trump voters that the whole thing is, quote unquote, rigged, because it was rigged for Democrats. You know, they selected a candidate who never got a vote in any presidential primary, whether this time or 4 years ago. But I think Trump can take advantage of the situation now. He has to go out there and talk about his policy agenda. He has to create a sense among his supporters that they can win by participating. They can win by voting. And to create a feeling of what winning feels like so that people can look ahead. That's why I wrote the book, The Agenda, because I wanted to create that kind of positive vision. And I really think that's what's lacking right now. This election, I think, is still Donald Trump's to lose. He's not going to get the Democrats to change over. He's not going to reach the audience that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are reaching. But he can reach his own audience. He can reach his own voters. And he needs to motivate them to stay in this just because they've watched this extraordinary turn of events, and just because they're watching the lies pump out on TV and on social media over and over again. That doesn't mean they should be discouraged. They can still elect him president if they stay involved and if he can give them a vision of where this is all going.
The agenda, I mean, you know, gosh, Joel, I don't know. It sounds pretty nefarious. It sounds almost like Project 2025. Aren't you afraid that this is going to be branded as the new and improved version of Trump's Mein Kampf, like Project 2025 was allegedly?
Project 2025 is a 922-page document that's a kind of telephone book for conservatives. Right. It was put together by hundreds of people. And I actually would have defended it on the basis that you need some kind of coherent governing strategy. I think it was a good attempt to say, okay, let's think about the future. Let's make sure that when there's a Republican administration and a Republican Congress, hopefully, that we can get our act together, that we can coordinate, not like last time in 2017 when Trump won and nobody was ready for it and people weren't sure where they were going to vote on Obamacare and so forth. I think it's actually necessary, and even though it's now been disavowed and thrown away and so forth, it'll still be useful. But I wrote the agenda without even knowing that Project 2025 existed, to be honest. And it's not a wish list of conservative priorities that you could achieve over 4 years in an administration. When I thought ahead to January 2025, I said, okay, what's it going to feel like when Trump takes office? And immediately I knew that the media narrative would become, oh, he's just a lame duck. He can't run for re-election. Let's talk about the candidates for 2028. They weren't going to give him a chance to govern. So I thought, okay, he can't waste any time. He's got to get into the White House and start issuing executive orders, executive actions, policy memoranda. He's got to do what is within his executive authority to do, and he's got to do it right away. So everything in the agenda is something that he can implement on day one. He doesn't have to wait for Congress. He doesn't have to wait to have the right people in the right agencies and so forth. Project 2025 is a really long-term plan, and
No, I understand the difference. I
like
mean,
nobody has a sense of what the overall picture is. My goal in the agenda was to say, this is what it looks like. This is what it feels like on January 20th, 2025.
well, so I mean, I assume that is executive orders in the direction of things like border security, that where the president has plenary power, personnel decisions. Is that the sort of thing you're talking about?
Yes, we need to address the border right away, and he can do that within his executive authority. But he can also make some fundamental changes with regard to the rule of law. He can, for example, revoke the security clearance of all 51 of those officials who signed that Russia disinformation letter about the Hunter Biden laptop. He can fire all the heads of the national security agencies who've been involved in all kinds of conspiracy mongering and deep state maneuvering. And I suggest that he can pardon nonviolent offenders on January 6th who simply walked across the lawn of the Capitol and so forth. It is offensive to Americans to see that we essentially have created political prisoners in this country. It violates our sense of the rule of law. He can do that right away. He can also take action on inflation right away. There are things that the president can do. Yes, the Federal Reserve controls the interest rate, but there are many things that a president can do. He can cancel, for example, some of the student loan forgiveness programs and some of the other COVID-era hangovers that Joe Biden has extended and extended again in an attempt to buy votes. Well, when people aren't paying their student loans, they're spending money on other things, which raises inflation. So there are things that Trump can do within his executive authority and that he should do. And he needs to say to people, I'm going to do this. If you vote for me, I can guarantee that I do this. This is not going to depend on some congressional bill passing. It's not going to depend on getting enough Democrats to break away and defeat a filibuster. It's not going to depend on whether I get this appointee confirmed or that appointee confirmed. This is what I can do on day one. So Project 2025 is an attempt to coordinate thousands of government employees along a conservative agenda. That's not what this is. The agenda, my book, is basically a plan for what Trump can do as soon as he gets to office.
Well, we got to get him into office. And right now, she's still the it girl, Kamala Harris, and she's changing on fracking. We know about that. And then on the mandatory gun buyback program, she doesn't want to do that. But then over the weekend in front of, servers and bartenders, she said no taxes on tips now. Which, can't she and Biden change that right now, what they have in place?
They could. And also, she was the tie-breaking vote on the bill to add 87,000 IRS agents who are busy going after bars and restaurants. So we know from her record that she doesn't take that seriously and she can't deliver the no taxes on tips pledge. But I would caution against getting too wrapped up in Kamala Harris and what she's doing and what the media are saying. We know her. She has the most left-wing record of any senator in the Senate. That was in 2019, her last year before running for president. We know that she is incompetent in office, and we know that right now she's still hiding her policies. There's nothing to her. She cannot govern, but she's going to get Democratic votes because they're desperate for a candidate. Again, if you talk to any of your Democrat friends, they're going to make up some reason to vote for her that has nothing to do with reality. It's not about what her policies actually are. She can't defend her policies. What Trump has to do to win is talk to his own supporters. He's got to talk to the people who are going to want to come out, but they want to know that he can win if they do so. Because getting all wrapped up in Kamala Harris reminds Trump supporters that the Democratic Party rigs its own primary, they rig their own presidential nomination, and they would rig the election if given the chance. You can't remind people of that because it discourages them. You've got to stick to what Trump is going to offer, what he's going to do on day one. And we can complain about media bias, and believe me, that's how I make my living, because there's so much of it around, and it needs to be debunked and deconstructed and all of that. But there also has to be a positive vision of what this looks like at the end. If Trump can't promise people that there's a light at the end of this tunnel, he's not going to get them to come out and vote and organize and make phone calls and donations and all the things that they need to do to be part of a winning campaign.
Joel Pollack, senior editor-at-large for Breitbart News. His new book, as we've been discussing in part, The Agenda, What Trump Should Do in His First 100 Days. It's available August 20th, but order it now. The Agenda, What Trump Should Do in His First 100 Days. Joel, thank you as always.
Thank you.
Thank you, and he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
This is the morning show more Chicago radio listeners are choosing. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
This is Sean Thompson. When you go on vacation, does it make sense to have somebody else pack for you? Of course not. The same can be said for your retirement. Your 401k could be packed with things you don't know about or even need. If you're close to retirement, but you don't have a plan customized to your goals, it's like kind of taking